one of the series of talks that we have been doing under Still Arts Moving for educational purpose. And today we are fortunate to meet you in Delhi, and we would like to share your views with our audience. And our audience is particularly students and other learners in different parts of India as well as abroad. So first I would like you to introduce yourself to my audience.
Thank you so much. I'm Anita Singh. I am a professor in the Department of English, and ever since I did my PhD, I was engaged in theatre, and I was working in American theatre, Arthur Miller specifically, and Doomed Hero, my topic of research was Doomed Hero in his play. So from Doomed Hero, studying about the heroes, I realized, well, of course, that I was passionate about this, and then I realized, where were the heroines? What about Linda? What about the wife of Winnie Loman and so on? So that gradually brought me to Indian theatre, and especially to women and women's engagement with theatre and so on.
Okay. So by research, by qualification, in a way you were more into theatrical practices. Was it more a study of the text that was circulated, or also studying performances?
Yeah, of course, initially, I got involved with the text. So it was through text I realized that how do you really do it, how do you really perform it? So from text, obviously I gravitated towards how it is performed, and there was this desire to see it staged, even in small measures. So staging a performance can be quite an impossible art, you understand that. So I started, doing it from the classrooms, from organizing small groups. I could not really get into something very large. Of course, eventually we did that also. We performed R3 in our university. But then we started from these, allowed students to do smaller performances and so on. Because I thought that a performative text, a play text, so to say, we read it as a deadly text in the class. I call it deadly text in the Brookian sense of the term. So you read it, the teacher teaches the text, and the student is a consumer. So I wanted it to be a living thing, lively thing. So that is what made me think of different pedagogical methods.
So the idea of performance is a very different idea in the sense that it is not a mechanical reproduction of the text. Rather, every time things get improvised, and in each production, the whole idea is in a way conceived altogether.
Obviously, different meaning evolves with every different production. It's like, I felt it's like reading a text, and every time you read a text, you say, oh, these are the things that I never realized. So it's like the same. When you perform it, you realize, oh, this is how this could be done, or this is a better way to do it. So we are always improvising. It's always in a state of improvisation, I believe so.
So do you think that the performance as a branch of knowledge must be incorporated with literature, particularly modern literature, which emerged out of printing press and out of necessity of different states to promote literature as a subject, whereas performances existed before the modern state as well as they do exist. So do you think that that now literature actually should incorporate these cases to widen its reach of understanding?
I strongly believe, that there was a time when I wouldn't say the colonial period or so, there was this desire to somewhere certify your imagination and your creativity. Somewhere, education meant that kind of stuff. So I believe to bring back that kind of a creativity, that kind of an imaginative appeal, so we need to bring in this kind of performance. Allow the students to imagine a situation or imagine an event, and how do you recreate that? So performing arts, as you said, even literature and performance incorporated into a textual study in a classroom has a lot of potential to do that, I believe so.
So you mean that actually performance has a lot to do with the movement, with the motion, and kind of space which is live and which is live to the extent that even we can imagine that the earth that we think is an inanimate kind of thing, but actually it is also performing all the time. It is rotating and then it is revolving. So in that sense, performance is something a fundamental thing for this planet.
Yeah, obviously we are all the time performing. We are all the time, doing some role or the other.
Yeah.
Every day you come, get up, and you open your wardrobe, and you think of what you wear, and where are you going. So every moment is a moment of performance. I mean, if you look at that way, if you translate it that way. So performance does, allow you this scope of, as you said, a more thought process into it, puts a lot of thought process into it. So that kind of enriches you and makes you grow more as an individual at the end of the day.
So if every moment is a performance, does that mean we are enacting texts all the time?
We are enacting texts that we have scripted for ourselves.
Yeah.
So when you are at an official meeting, so you enact the text that is scripted for that occasion, the normatives of how do you behave in an official meeting.
Right.
So, and then when you are at home, when you are all alone, then you let go of all kind of, and you say that, oh, now I am myself.
Okay.
Now I am myself. So that's how it is. So every occasion has its own kind of, one would say, normatives that we perform, a script that it has.
Isn't myself and home also text?
Yeah, it is also a different kind of a text. I believe that this is a text and I am free and I can do what I want to do.
Yeah.
So that's also a kind of a
For
text.
example, being alone, accepting a certain kind of gender.
Yes.
So one is that also not a kind of performance. One is performing that gender, and one is not really having any choice for that.
Yes, obviously. I mean, how do you empty yourself of everything? The fact is, how do you empty it? You start from point zero. If you can empty yourself of everything, all givens, all pre-givens rather. If you can empty yourself of all pre-givens and start at a point zero.
Okay.
So
So
that's also kind of.
Peter Brook's renowned book, The Empty Space. What would you like to say about this book and its significance in performance?
And this book has a lot of significance because it has a lot of relevance to the kind of performative practices that we have. I mean, whether you take it to cinema, whether you take it to anything, Bollywood for that matter.
Yeah.
So he talks about 4 kinds of performative spaces rather. Because his book is titled The Empty Space. He says a man walks in an empty space and someone is watching him, and this is all that it takes for an act of theatre to be engaged. So although I usually indulge in a lot of
that let us simplify it for our students.
Yes.
Say empty space, a man walks into it and somebody watches it, and then it is a performance.
It's an act of performance, and that is
There are
engaging.
few elements here.
Elements, yeah.
There is one
Empty space.
spectator, there is a space, there is somebody who walks. So these are three
Spaces.
Okay.
So Brook also essentially believes that a decorated stage, a proscenium arch with all the proppings may not be the right kind of a stage. All you need is an empty stage. So now the focus is, there was a time when the focus was how beautiful your background is, how beautiful sceneries have you put up. Now the emphasis is on the actor, the body of the actor.
Okay.
How do you perform with your body,
Okay.
So all you need is an empty space and a man who walks in that empty space. He walks, he performs what all he does, and there's somebody who watches him. That is what that makes a theatrical, art. That's what that makes a theatre. Theatre is all about walking in an empty space. You do not need a rich theatre. So it's what Grotowski talks about, rich theatre versus the poor theatre. So rich theatre was something that was decorative, which had a lot of props. The background kind of surfaced and overpowered the actor. So here it is the actor. How do you emote? How do you perform on stage? That becomes, so the focus becomes on the actor's body.
Okay, okay. So, as actor's body has to walk, and in most of exercises that Peter Brook used to teach his students, movements have to actually de-burden themselves of the blocks which are there in the mind.
Yes.
Okay. So when the process of de-burdening of the blocks starts, then you walk, and that walk is your walk. Okay. And so that walk is something closer to the idea of empty space.
Yes.
That it means you are not carrying the bundle of blocks of different kinds of identities which have been constructed for you.
Yes.
And you are actually, you believe that you are sitting at some place, so you must believe that you are sitting here, okay, instead of indulging yourself in some other space.
Yeah, the kind of experiment that even Richard Sisher went into, like he created those blocks and he allowed the actors to get into, and he wrote certain things in that, like angle, mood.
Yeah.
So you move from one block into the other block. So you don't be in that block for very long. So how you can switch off and switch off. So that is the key to becoming a good actor. So how you...
So we were talking about Stanislavski's an actor careers, and at the same time Peter Brook. And Peter Brook also emphasizes a lot on preparation. And it is preparation which actually differentiates the presenter from the person who watches that act. So, do you think that Peter Brook is in a way collaborating his theory with Stanislavski?
Yes, to some extent, like they were, Stanislavski was more emphasizing on the mental makeup. This is apart from the superficial outward makeup, one needs to concentrate on your mindset. You have to train your mind. You have to be what if. He uses the proposition what if.
Okay.
You have to think what if I am that, and you have to live that character. For a long term, you inhabit that body. You inhabit. What if this happened to me? What if somebody died? Very close to me, and how will I react? So this kind of what if hypothetical situation, the actor was supposed to be engrossed in and engaged in while enacting a role. Now with Peter Brook, it was more the physicality as well, more so with the mentality, with the mental makeup as well as the physical body. And he was more emphasizing also the physical body. So he got this from the Asians, like whether it was Brook or Richard Sisher, Grotowski. So they are all influenced by Asian performative art, where body becomes a very important component of acting. It's a tool that's presented on stage.
Yeah. And body is not as a body.
Yes.
It is alive, and it is not just a surface.
Yes, it's not a surface.
Yeah, it is something that registers all kinds of things which are around us, whether of social or natural or something like that.
It creates a lot of meaning.
Yeah.
It is a semiotic space, so to say.
Okay.
It creates a lot of meaning. The body creates a lot of meaning. Rather than having the meaning being derived from putting up certain things on stage.
Okay.
So how can you use the body to give all that meaning that you want to give in a play? So that was the whole idea of one, training the body and training the mind. So these were two things that they were focusing on. And this also takes us back to our seminal text, the Natya Shastra, where you have this training the body as well as training the mind. You train the mind to a certain performative action, and you train your body as well for that.
In Natya Shastra.
In Natya Shastra. It talks about the body, it talks about the mind, it talks about the ornaments as well. It does talk about that as well. But the sattvic, the mind also becomes very important when you are acting, as well as your body. They become important to communicate. They're communicative tools, rather.
Peter Brook somewhere emphasizes the language of universality, That is, body language is universal, and that is why he casts different kinds of people from different parts of the world in Mahabharata. And
yes.
So, to what extent does he actually use anthropology to create this space?
He did a lot of experiment with what is now recognized as intercultural theatre. The term that is used for it is intercultural theatre. And he believes that there is some kind of a semiotic that is universal. Okay. Certain kind of bodily expressions that are universal, of grief, of happiness, of sorrow, of love, of joy, and so on. Okay. But of course, there have been a lot of, because every community has a different way of, one would say, expressions. So bodily expressions are also sculpted, if you believe that. So to that extent, how this intercultural theatre would function. So, I mean, that's the idea. But he did a lot of research, and a lot of research going on. Even research section, among others, are into what they call as intercultural theatre.
Yeah, just broad spectrum.
Yes. So if there is a theatre where we can use human body as a kind of a connection between humanity as a whole. So that was their idea.
So this wasn't it more about belief that belief and ritual? They have a connection, and this intercultural is it in the sense we understand historicity, or is it in the sense we create and utter sounds and we move our bodies, and all of the sounds and bodies that we utter, they are sounds and they are movements. In that sense, is it not universal?
Yeah, exactly. That was what we were trying to find, some kind of a universal language of theatre. So they were looking at a universal language of theatre. Some kind of a primordial response to a certain situation, as you said, the sounds, the ritualistic theatre. So they were bringing in this ritual theatre and the primordial modes of expression and so on. So something that happens very instinctively. So if they can bring that together and have that kind of an instinctual response to and create a theatre which has meaning and which one would say which has connotations across all cultures. So they were creating a grammar of theatre that was on a more universal level.
So in this context, if we go to Bertolt Brecht and look at his contribution, what is that contribution, and in what sense is it different or similar with Peter Brook?
Brecht came at a time when Aristotelian theatre was very rampant, and that was the only mode of theatre that we knew. Theatre that had a beginning, middle, and an end. The spectator were more of, had the kind of response was they were either narcissistic or they were voyeuristic, and so theatre was, as Brecht says, was an opium for the masses. And also Brecht was writing at a time of the repressive regimes. So he took theatre as a very important tool of social consciousness. And somebody has said that theatre is a hammer to change society. It's not something that that lulls you into. It's not something consumable. You cannot consume and go away happy. You have to be thought-provoking. It has to be a place for raising consciousness, so to say. So he brought in those devices that we recognize as the alienation effect, Wolfram Dung effect, and the epic theatre, so which breaks at a certain point. It does not run as a narrative. It is not a metonymy of reality. It's not a realist slice of life that you're watching, but you're constantly made aware of this is a theatrical performance. And so there are a lot of interruptions. He used to have play cards. He used to have insertions of song and drama. He used to have dialogues with the audience. So break the audience out of the feeling that it's not a theatre. So those meta-theatrical devices that he used in his theatre was a mode to keep an engagement with the spectator. And he called those spectators spect actors. He
Okay.
wanted them to be actors as well,
Okay.
not passive listeners. So these actors that he wanted the spectators to be, he was like, theatre for him was a microcosm of the nation that he was looking at, the world that he wanted to be the way that it wanted to be. He wanted people to be more alert to what is happening and not take things lying down, so to say.
Yeah.
So theatre had a different meaning. It was situated in a different context, and the innovations and the techniques that he evolved were in consonance with the times that he was living in. So kind of alternate endings that he had to his plays. So he made audience think which would be the right ending to a particular play and so on.
So Brecht did several innovations, and that actually changed the scenario of theatre. And theatre then was more, it was closer to its times, particularly to analyze the times or to incorporate what is there, which is good in modernity, as democratic elements. So in a way, he deconstructed the whole idea of tragedy, and he brought something very collective space. In that space, at least people could feel pain or pleasure together, okay, and they could understand that they were not in a plot, they themselves could create episodes. So this whole idea of episodic structure and the plotted structure, I mean, how does it actually work?
Episode was like, certain episodes, collage, what we call. So these episodes were building up the larger picture that you wanted to present before the audience. So it was like episode again was a certain disjuncture. It acted as kind of a break. So if the narrative went on in a linear movement, so the audience were kind of led to believe that it is a reality that they're watching. So episode was something that would make them alive to the fact that it was one part. So episodic structure also was a device that did not allow, that was what he referred to, defamiliarizing device. It was not automation as, so he wanted to break, given certain breaks. So that was a device for that, basically.
And another big name is Augusto Boal and his Theatre of the Oppressed. What news do you have about that?
Boal again was very relevant, as I said, that a lot of good work happens when you are in repressive times. So Boal also was writing around a certain time which was repressive, and he was greatly indebted to Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. And for Boal, theatre was a kind of pedagogy, and he was more into a kind of a workshop kind of a theatre, participatory theatre that he called.
Okay.
And he called theatre a therapeutic place.
Right.
Now what is interesting about Baulian theatre was that he actually brought the oppressed. Oppressed here means people who had certain issues on hand, rather than what we had IPTA. We had IPTA in India. So IPTA's approach was more top-down. Like the actors knew what they were doing, and actors had the message, and the actor had the solutions to the things, whether it was a famine problem, whether it was the problem of the problem of women or whatever. So it had a more top-down approach, whereas Baulian theatre it worked more on a grassroots level. So taking experiences, bringing those experiences, and creating a kind of a workshop theatre out of that. So his basic purpose was to make people see, look, analyze, and understand what is happening in their lives. So rather than something to be seen, put up as a piece that you enjoy, so it was more of kind of an engagement with your everyday issues that he made into a kind of a theatre. So he had different ways in which he organized his Theatre of the Oppressed, like he had this musical theatre, he had different ways, games and all that he played with his actors. He allowed the actors to play games. And even physicality, there was a lot of physicality in his theatre. So physicality meant he made the actors do certain exercises. So So the exercises, by exercises he means that your body also gets automatized. Your body movement also gets automatized.
Okay.
So to get your body out of its habitual ways of situating itself. So similarly, once you get your body out of a certain structure, you get your mind out of a certain structure. So that was his idea, to kind of liberate your body and liberate your mind.
Okay.
So that was what he was moving towards. Basically, theatre as a tool to teach, as a pedagogy of the oppressed, that he said, that the very title of his book mentions. And then also there was this cop in the mind approach that he had. Again, he had different ways in which he went about it. Interactive theatre, political theatre, and theatre of the cop in the mind, he says. So how to bring out your repressed ideas in your mind. How the things that are lying behind your mind, how do you bring it out and how do you get out of it, and so on.
So that is somewhere, it's a therapeutic
theatre that he calls it.
Aristotle too.
Exactly.
Catharsis.
Talked about catharsis in a different way, and here is the catharsis that the actors undergo.
This is anti-catharsis.
Yes, it's anti-catharsis. So here Paul was, Aristotle was talking about the effect of a tragedy, the effect of a comedy. You achieve a kind of a catharsis. You see the actors performing on stage and you have this pity and you fear. You identify and you do not identify with that. You pity them somewhere out there, and you fear, you identify. This could happen to you as well. So there are two responses.
Okay.
So here it is more the actors who go through this transformation. It is more the actors who are going through the transformation. And of course that goes on to the spectators as well. And usually his plays were structured in a very different way. He would have a performance, and then he would have a joker in the performance, and then he would keep a situation. He would keep a problematic situation on stage. Then stop it at that, fix and freeze at that, and then he would call people from the audience to reenact it the way they want. So if you have any issue with the way that we have ended it or brought it to a halt, so do you want it to happen in a different way? So can you visualize it some other way? So he had a lot of very enthusiastic audience who would come up and say, no, we want it to end it this way, or we want this to be this way. So how can you revision what you have seen? So the capacity, he was empowering the audience also to develop a capacity to revision things. So again, the thinking mind, not just the performers who are performing, but also the audience participation becomes very important. So they are also emboldened, empowered to look at the situation and see what alternatives those situations can have. So that's that's a different approach that we had to theatre.
Anita ji, as you know, India is a culturally very rich nation, which means that there is a lot of heterogeneity here. There are different schools of yoga, there are different kinds of practices of yoga. Similarly, in performing arts or visual arts, we have different kinds of texts, different kinds of theories, which are found in a very different manner in different communities. But there are few texts that in a way we refer to in our academia, for example, Yoga Sutra when we talk of yoga, and Natya Shastra when we talk of performing arts and visual arts. So, would you like to say something about Natya Shastra and its significance and relevance in performing and visual arts?
Of course, Natya Shastra is a very important text, we all know, and somehow we have not really placed it so significantly in our culture, interestingly. We need to revive it once more. And now what is very interesting about Natya Shastra, what we have just done about Paul, Brecht and others is, those were the texts that came out in repressive times. Even Natya Shastra, if you look at the preliminaries, so it says that it was born out of inner time when people were lazy, lethargic, they were not doing anything creative. So it kind of establishes the creative function of theatrical arts. So at the outset it says it it lays down the significance of theatrical arts, and in very early chapters, I think in chapter 4 or 5, I guess, it establishes what the importance of Natya Shastra. That it is not just for amusement, it is for education, it is for the betterment of the society. It makes men better being. You know, it makes men better being.
Right.
So that was the basic purpose, you know, to civilize them, basically to civilize them.
Right.
So that was the function of Natya Shastra. Now, how was theatre was envisaged? Of course, it had this ritual and it had this sacred function. There is a chapter in Natya Shastra which talks about the Natya Graha, you know, the theatre houses, how the theatre houses were built. So how the theatre houses were built, a lot of ceremonies occurred, those pillars were consecrated and so on. So it was a sacred space. So like the Greek theatre started as a sacred space and so on. So it's all started from a religious ceremony and so on. So here also it had a sacred function as well as a social function. So, and this sacred space also was a means to bring people together. It was a kind of a collective occasion. All people are together. So, as a social space. So, sacred space, social space, both are functioning together. And what we have in Natya Shastra is what we normally now call as a total theatre, a complete theatre. So we have it's an amalgamation of all arts. You have music, you have song, you have dance, and you have performative body. So you have everything. So that's a perfect theatre that you can possibly think of. And gradually over time, we saw how music and songs, when took a back step and the dialogue became very important in early 18th, 19th and early 20th century. And we had a revision of that when we went to the Theatre of the Roots. Suresh Awasthi's Theatre of the Roots. We talk about Theatre of the Roots. So Natya Shastra is very important in the sense that it brings together all arts in a stage. And of course the performative stage was there, and it was very codified. It was very codified. If you look at the text and you see how Bharat Muni has defined everything so in such graphic details, whether it is, I'll give you an example of a chapter that talks about the gait of the female, the way that she walks. So the characters that belong to every class have a specific way of walking. Then there's another chapter that talks about the ornaments. So women of high class would wear a particular kind of an ornament, women of lower class would wear a particular ornament. So he was kind of very exhaustive in the way that he has detailed the performance, right from the audience response to the way the critics would, appreciate a play or respond to a play, the way the play was structured, the theatrical houses, the costumes, the characters, and even the actors as their lives. So we see how detailed text it is. It's very exhaustive in its range and scope.
So his codification actually is reflected in various arts in India. For example, it's very difficult to find sculpture even in a worshipping place which that sculpture has more fat or kind of body which has not done labor. Most of the bodies that we design out of Natya Shastra, they are perfectly carved, which means they might have existed a kind of culture which was influenced by Natya Shastra, and it was more philosophy as well, besides the norms of creative arts.
Exactly. It was a kind of an art that was to be learned, an exercise that was to be practiced. It was an art that you needed to practice. So it did talk about how you shape your body as well as you shape your mind. So in that sense of the term, Natya Shastra also details how your body is also important as well as your mind is important in the performative art. So as I said that later on somewhere you learn a dialogue and you perform on stage. So later on the experiments that we had, whether it was even Stanislavski was talking about the method acting. So in Natya Shastra you have everything. You have the actor into rasas, when he talks about the rasas very extensively.
Yeah.
So how do you create that mood? Rasa is very roughly translated as mood. So the creation of the mood in the actors and the creation of the mood that gets translated to the spectator. Who is a Sahridaya? Who is a Sahridaya? Who understands the mood and who is empathetic to that. So how do you translate a mood? How do you translate a posture? So the posture that you are talking about, the body that is, that is sculpted. So body that is sculpted and a mind that is set to a particular mood. That was what it was. So that art was very perfect. That art that it was trying to achieve, that was very perfect. A perfection in the body and a perfection in the mind. So, but it was very codified, so to say.
So Natya in a way is a very broad term.
Broad term, actually.
And actually Natya or Nat. So in a way identifying a living organism or human being as a nut or as a Natya is more like identifying that person or that thing in a larger cosmos at a very universal level.
Absolutely.
So in that sense, so all the balances which are talked about in that text, they are more about how to live ethically in a world where all kinds of things have to be in harmony and some kind of environmental coordination. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, it was the way like being and becoming. Well, if you talk in existential terms, so we are being and we are always in the process of becoming. And we talk about, it does talk about the ethical living, being this being in the world, and how we are always, trying to move towards, a better approximation, so to say. We are moving towards a better way of living. Finding a better alternative to your life. So that was what Natya Shastra intended to do. As I said in the beginning, ethical, amusement, edification. Education that leads to an ethical life, ethical characters, ethical performers, ethical spectators, and taken on a more larger scale, a more ethical society. And it was born out of an anarchy, as I said. Society were thought to be very anarchist. Society was thought to be in a disarray, and to bring that to order, this art came into being. So the basic function of the art is to bring order in a disorder.
So Grace and Augusta Ball and Peter Brook, Bharat Muni, so they are all kind of neighbors, like R.K. Narayan's Malgudi and Marquise's Macando. Okay, so
yes, I would just like to say, in short, all these theorists are trying to answer the question how to make the outside world a better place to live in.
Yeah.
For us.
Yeah. Through journey
through inner journey. Yes, exactly.
Thank you very much, Angelasi. It was a nice meeting, and many things that you said, perhaps many of the students will know them for the first time, and it's very important, crucial for us to share all these